Our topic this evening is what happened to the 12 apostles. This is something that I was sort of thinking about as a topic on the recent trip that we took to Italy. So for example, we went to the incredible medieval cathedral in Salerno, Italy, which Salerno had been the capital of one of the independent Lombard principalities and was later taken over by the Norman warlord Robert Guiscard, who began building a basilica modeled on the, you can see the basilica form there, modeled on the Constantinian basilicas in Rome, the 4th century ones. This is an 11th century one. There's many of the multicultural aspects of southern Italy at the time are present, including Muslim qualities of decoration, but also Greek in terms of the mosaics, and Latin as well. And unfortunately, at a certain point, it was redecorated, and so lots of that was lost, but a lot of it did survive. Anyway, while we were at this really incredible cathedral, which is dedicated, among others, to the Apostle Matthew, we realized that one of the massively redecorated parts is the Baroque crypt of the Apostle Matthew beneath the sanctuary. And so this is the traditional resting place for the Apostle Matthew. And we sort of wondered, all right, well, how did Matthew, according to tradition, is a Galilean, if according to the Gospels that is a Galilean, how does he end up in Salerno? And right next door to Salerno in Italy, in the city of Amalfi, we have another one of these incredible cathedrals that mixes this Arabesque style with Greek and Latin traditions. And we have, again, another beautiful cathedral that maintains some of its 11th century character, but has been redecorated a lot as well, including the facade, which has been remade to kind of evoke the original. And once again, in the crypt below the cathedral in Amalfi, we have the tomb of one of the apostles, the Apostle Andrew in this case. So Andrew, again, a Galilean fisherman, the brother of Simon Peter in the Gospels. How does Andrew end up being buried in Amalfi? So we started thinking, where are all of these traditional tombs? Some, of course, are more famous than others, like the tomb of St. Peter in the Vatican. Obviously, Amalfi and Salerno, as we kind of map them out here in Italy, are more or less right next to each other. They're near neighbors. One of the other seats of the Lombard principalities in the Middle Ages, Benevento, is also quite nearby. And Benevento claims to have one of the tombs, anyway, of the Apostle Bartholomew. There are other rival claimants, as we'll see, for most of the apostles and their relics. Famously, of course, we said Rome houses the tombs of both Peter in the Vatican and also Paul the Apostle. There's another Constantinian basilica that's outside the classical walls of Rome, St. Paul outside the walls it's called, which is understood to be, according to tradition, the tomb of St. Paul. And Rome also claims to house the tombs or relics of the apostles Philip, Simon the Zealot, James the Less, and like I say, Bartholomew, who is maybe in a couple different places according to tradition. And then also within Italy, the city of Padua is one of the cities that claim to have the tomb, or at least some of the relics of the apostle Matthias. Matthias being the apostle who replaces Judas Iscariot according to the book of Acts. So again, a bunch of Judean or Galilean disciples of Jesus, and lots of them here ending up in the West, according to tradition. So where are all of these traditional tombs, including competing claims? And as we look at the competing claims and the traditions, what are the sources of those traditions? How early are they? How accurate are they? How likely are any of these to have historicity? In other words, to what extent do we really believe any part of the body of the Apostle Matthew, for example, is buried there in the crypt in Salerno? So that's what we're going to look at this evening. Let's just start by getting an overview of our understanding of the 12 apostles. So in ancient and medieval artwork, the 12 apostles are often depicted together. For example, here, the main gate of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. We have Christ in the center of the doors and the apostles flanking him, the 6 guys on either side, all the other wonderful imagery and art. So it's very frequent on medieval Western, especially cathedrals, to have sculptures or relief sculptures that are depicting the 12 apostles at the gates, for example. So we can identify them. I mean, they more or less all look kind of the same. They're guys with beards, with the exception of the Apostle John, who is depicted without having a beard, since he's understood to be the youngest of the 12. But, for example, at the immediate flanking of the gates, we have the 2 most important apostles, Peter. You can identify him usually because he's holding his attribute of keys, because Jesus says, you know, thou art Peter, and upon you I will build the rock. Upon you as a rock. You know, Peter is a nickname that means rock. Upon this rock I will build my church, and I'll give you the keys of the kingdom, so that you can bind and loose in heaven and on earth. And so Peter is depicted with keys, and you have Paul on the other side, who's usually depicted holding a sword, which is understood to be the gospel message, along with maybe his letters. And the other apostles have their various attributes. As I say, John is depicted as young, without a beard, and maybe often holding a cup, which is understood to be the Holy Grail. Andrew, the brother of Peter, usually has an X cross because of the tradition about his crucifixion on such a cross. Simon is usually holding a saw for reasons we'll see, and so forth. So we're looking at all of the 12 in those kind of decorations. But although we think of the role of apostle often very synonymously, we just think the word apostle is a synonym for the 12, and we often talk about the 12 apostles. In fact, in first century Christianity, in the diverse movements of Christianity, there are many more than 12 apostles. So apostle is a role in the early church where people essentially are functioning like a Franciscan friar or a Buddhist monk, where you have, as Jesus says to the rich young man, sell all your property and give to the poor and come follow me. And so the apostles have done that. They have they've rejected materialism and property, and instead are living in the Spirit. And as they go around and travel and share the good news in pairs, they don't take, you know, a purse or property with them, but instead live by the donations of those people who meet. They ask each day in their prayers that God will provide them with their daily bread, and so forth. So that role of apostle is what spreads the early movement. And again, there's many more than 12. So for example, we have in the writings of Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, he makes a big distinction between the apostles and the 12. So Paul writes to the early Christian community that he has founded in the Greek city of Corinth, I handed on to you of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried and was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, which is the Aramaic version of the name Peter, which is the Greek version. He appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. So we have the 12 here at the beginning of this, and Cephas, Peter, being associated with them. Then the risen Christ appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died, as of the time Paul is writing this letter. Then he appeared to James, Jesus' brother, and then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. So all the apostles here, including both James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul himself, they're listed then, as being distinct from Cephas and Peter, that is, and the 12. So the 12 are apostles, but they are a subset of 12 of the apostles, and the apostles are a much larger group, which Paul himself claims to be a member of that larger group. And although Paul is one of the most famous apostles, and although Paul is often believed to be one of the 12 apostles, as in even pictured in art in churches like Notre Dame among the 12, by his own account, he was never one of the 12. So Cephas and the 12 he talks about, and he talks about James and all the apostles, and last of all to him, one of the apostles, but not one of the 12. In Paul's letter to the Romans, Paul greets two other apostles, Junia and Andronicus by name, and he mentions that they were sister and brother in Christ before him, and that they have now become renowned among the apostles. So Junia and Andronicus are apostles, but they are not also part of the 12. So if we look at Paul's traditional resting place, as I mentioned, he's said to be buried in Rome, outside the walls of Rome, in a Constantinian basilica built in the 4th century, beginning with at the orders of the Emperor Constantine, which is now called St. Paul, outside the walls. How do we understand, or how do we know that Paul's there? Well, our earliest reference to Paul being there comes from around the year 96 AD, when Clement of Rome talks about the martyrdoms of Paul and Peter, and he does that without stating that these took place in Rome, but he is talking about the glorious martyrs, and he is from Rome. And we also have in the 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea quoting a lost source from around the year 200, Gaius the presbyter, who states, so Gaius, writing in the year 200, states, I can point out the memorials of the apostles here in Rome. For if you go to the Vatican, or if you go to the Ostian Way, you will find the memorials of those who founded this church. And so Gaius the presbyter is telling us then that by the end of the 2nd century, the Christians in Rome have already developed a tradition that their church had been founded by Peter and Paul. That's not actually true, because as Paul is writing himself in the letter to the Romans, their church already existed and Paul hasn't been there yet and Peter isn't there. But nevertheless, he was probably meaning that they are the founders of Christianity in general, according to tradition, now that we get to the end of the 2nd century. But moreover, he is saying, more importantly for our purposes, he's saying that Peter and Paul have either been martyred in Rome, or we at least know that their shrines are there. So Peter's is at the Vatican, and Paul's is on the Via Ostia, which is where the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls is. We also have a description in Acts, the book of Acts, that Paul, right up into the end of the book, is set to go to trial in Rome. And for the time period while he's waiting for this trial, he is renting a villa right outside the walls. And so we have, anyway, in the book of Acts, the idea that Paul is on his way there, and so that connects it a little bit. But we don't have anything more closely to connect this tradition that Paul is actually buried in St. Paul beyond the walls. But anyway, we can't do it any more closely, but it's pretty close as far as all of these are going to go, all these traditions are going to go. So while Paul's traditional place of martyrdom and burial, that's among the strongest attested of any of the apostolic burial places in the historical record, since Paul isn't one of the 12, it's actually outside the scope of the presentation. So like I say, he's often pictured among the 12 apostles, like on Notre Dame, or here in his own basilica, St. Paul outside the walls, where Paul is here with Luke. I'm sorry, Luke is also not one of the apostles, but anyway, Paul is here with Peter, and all the apostles are also shared under them. But like I say, he's an apostle, but not one of the 12. So another person that's not pictured here, in other words, how do you get to 12? Well, one of the 12 apostles, according to the Gospels, is Judas Iscariot, the apostle who betrays Jesus. And then, according to the book of Acts, after Judas betrays Jesus, the 11 draw lots and replace him with someone named Matthias. And so essentially, when we're getting the list of 12 apostles in artwork like this, and we see Paul placed there when he shouldn't be, the person that he's displacing or snubbing is either Judas or Matthias, depending on how we're counting the 12. So given that Paul's not one of the 12, let's move on to the most famous of the 12, Peter. And so when we were reading that source, Gaius the Presbyter, writing around the year 200, he also recorded the tradition that Peter was martyred at the Vatican, or it was at least has his shrine at the Vatican. And so the Vatican is the name of a hill opposite the Tiber from the main 7 hills of Rome. And so it also is outside the walls of the ancient city of Rome anyway. And on that side of the river, the Emperor Gaius, the Emperor Caligula built a circus, that is to say a chariot racing stadium. And circuses and amphitheaters were, again, sites where executions took place. And so it would make sense that during persecutions, which is what tradition has, that Peter is martyred by the emperor as part of during an early persecution that's limited to the city of Rome, it would make sense that he would be executed in one of these public executions in a circus or a stadium. And so tradition has it being here. And we can see, if you look at the outlines on this plan, the idea of where the circus had been overlap is the gray at the bottom. Then we have old St. Peter's, the Constantinian basilica that was built in the 4th century by the Emperor Constantine and continued to exist all through the Middle Ages. And then that was torn down, and the big dotted outline of modern St. Peter's built in the Renaissance by the Renaissance popes. And in all the cases, you can see right in the middle of what would now be the dome of New St. Peter's, you can see a little half circle there which has St. Peter's tomb that is right on the outside or opposite the Circus of Nero on a Roman road that used to go through there, the Via Cornelia. And so putting graves outside the city walls was Roman practice. And so the walls, the streets that are leading away from Rome are where many monuments to the dead are normally found from ancient Rome. And so it's not that it doesn't make sense. It is sensible that Peter, if he made it to Rome and if he was executed by the emperor in a public execution, that it would happen at a place like the Circus of Nero, and that he would then be buried at a tomb along a road like this. All of it makes sense. And what we can say is that by the year 200, we know that that's a tradition that existed in Rome. However, in 2 previous lectures that we had on the historical Peter, that is the historical Peter and was Peter the first pope, we examined in a lot of detail all of the sources that we have for Peter, beginning with, the Apostle Paul's letter, where we can say Peter is a historical figure because Paul, who is somewhat of a rival of Peter and talks about being antagonistic towards him and having arguments with him, that Paul actually talks about meeting this person in person. but he does so in Jerusalem and in Antioch, not in Rome. So we don't place him in Rome from that. When we look at the Gospel and the book of Acts, once again, we have all sorts of more information and stories about Peter that are now being written a generation or two after Peter has died. But again, they don't place him in Rome. It's set earlier than that. In the rest of our New Testament texts, we have in the pseudepigraphical letters attributed to Peter the idea that Peter may be writing from the New Babylon. And so there's a tradition already towards the end of the first century that a person writing in Peter's name, pretending to be Peter, is saying, greetings from Babylon, and by which he probably means Rome, since the Romans have now destroyed Jerusalem the same way that the Babylonians had. So it's not written by Peter, but written and aware of a tradition that Peter is in Rome by the end of the first century. We have more of those from increasingly in the first and second centuries, and until at the end of the second century, Irenaeus is very clear about it. And then we have pseudepigraphical texts like the Acts of Peter. And then finally, we have the reflections of 3rd and 4th century Christians that are trying to piece together what all these traditions are. And so as a result of all that, we sort of concluded that whereas it's completely possible that Peter made it to Rome and is buried in the Vatican, that it's also, it's also completely you were completely able to argue that that's a tradition that started to really take hold in the 2nd century. So for example, the tomb that has been found or rediscovered beneath the Vatican, this doesn't necessarily mean that the remains, these house the remains of Peter. We found bones that can be dated to a 1st century person, but what we can say is that Gaius the presbyter, who's writing around the year 200, and he says that he could point out where Peter's tomb is at the Vatican. That's the tomb that's now been found again, or that's the site that's now been found again. And like I say, it's about as close as we're going to get with a historical apostle in terms of connecting tradition to an actual historical figure, but it doesn't quite get us there. While the sources connecting Peter to Rome are pretty tenuous prior to the end of the 2nd century, his fate among the 12 apostles, though, is actually among the best attested. And so as we consider the other 11 of the 12, we're going to first have to generate a list. Who are those 11? And in fact, unlike the apostles of Jesus that are part of the 12 that Paul says he met, which is just Peter and John, the rest of these lists are actually quite late, as the Gospels are written towards the end of the 1st century. And they also have some minor contradictions, so they don't quite agree with one another. So our earliest Gospel, Mark, written around the year 70, gives the first list of the 12. So we read in Mark chapter 3, Jesus went up the mountain and called to him those whom he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12 to be with him and to be sent out. So the word apostle means to be sent out. And to be sent out to preach and to have authority to cast out demons. And so he appointed the 12. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, the sons of thunder, a name that we really don't hear ever again after Mark says it that way, but anyway, James and John, and Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, who handed him over. So that's our earliest list of the names of the 12 apostles. So as is usually understood, and as we pretty much have argued through lots and lots of lectures, the authors of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were working from Mark's gospel, so they had access to that text that they had in front of them, and they're using it as a source. And so therefore they take that list and repeat it with just some minor changes. By contrast, the authors of the fourth gospel, the gospel we now call John, are working from their own separate Johannine tradition, and they also don't give a complete list. They just mention some of the apostles every now and then. But at least one of those that they mention, Nathaniel, is not on Mark's list. And one of the major characters, who is one of the apostles in the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple, is anonymous, so we don't know, if it's one of the 12 that are on Mark's list or not. Tradition names the beloved disciple John, but we've had lectures on why that's not necessarily clear and why it doesn't quite work. So let's look then at those lists that we have and how they change. So for Mark, as we just read, we have Simon Peter, John, James, Judas Iscariot, Thomas, Andrew, Simon the Canaanian, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Bartholomew, and Thaddeus. All right, so as we say, Matthew comes next, and he has that same list. He doesn't make a lot of changes. He changes the Simon the Canaanian to Simon the Canaanite. And he makes it so that Matthew is a publican, a tax collector, by taking a story that Mark ascribes to Levi, the son of Alphaeus, and assigning that to Matthew. But otherwise, Matthew follows Mark very, very closely, as he tends to. Luke does the same, but Luke makes one more, doesn't make Matthew a tax collector, so that's not there. But the major changes, not major, but anyway, one of the changes is that instead of calling Simon a Canaanite or a Canaanian, Luke says Simon the Zealot, and we'll talk about what that all may mean. And then, interestingly, instead of having the last of these, Thaddeus, that gets replaced with a second Judas, so Judas, the son of James. And then, because the author of Luke also wrote Acts, we have at the first chapter of Acts the idea that after Judas's fall and death, he's replaced by an apostle called Matthias, and that only exists in Acts. And then finally, in John, like I say, we don't have a complete list. James and John are not named, but we do have the name called the sons of Zebedee. And so even though John is often called this beloved disciple, this anonymous beloved disciple, he's not one of the sons of Zebedee, or he's not identified that way. Those seem to be a different character in John. Judas, instead of being called Judas Iscariot, is called Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Thomas is given the additional name Didymus. And then instead of some of these lesser known apostles, instead of Bartholomew, we have Nathaniel. And again, we don't have Thaddeus, but we have a second Judas who John calls Judas, but not the Iscariot, so a different Judas, essentially. And so those are our lists of 12 that we'll kind of work from. Tradition, of course, conflates all these and fixes it so that contradictions are explained away. So like I say, tradition conflates John with the beloved disciple, and Bartholomew with Nathaniel, and Thaddeus with Judas, the son of James, who is not Judas the Iscariot. And so because we are looking at the fates that tradition assigns to each of the 12, along with the fate of Matthias, who replaces Judas Iscariot, according to the book of Acts, we're going to go ahead and conflate these two for the purposes of looking at the traditional places where they end up. So let's start with Judas Iscariot. So while the Gospel of John alludes vaguely to the idea that Peter is eventually going to be martyred, but doesn't say how or what's going to happen, it's just at the very end, Judas Iscariot is one of just 2 of the 12 whose deaths are, actually recorded in the New Testament. I'll say Judas, in terms of the name, like Jude, it's a Greek rendering of the name Judah, the Hebrew name Judah. Judah was, of course, one of the biblical patriarchs, one of the 12 sons of Israel, and specifically, he's the eponymous ancestor for the tribe of Judah, the Judahites. And that is the central tribe of the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. And indeed, then we get the name, Judean and Jew from the name Judah, or rather, the name Judah is the eponymous ancestor for the name of that people. So this continued to be a very, very popular name in the first century of the Common Era, in part because in the Hasmonean kingdom that had been briefly independent right before the Roman period, that was founded by a revolt led by a character called Judas the Hammer or Judas Maccabeus. And so maybe in part because of how important that heroic figure had been, lots of people are getting named, lots of young Judeans are getting named Judas in this time period. And so it's important, even though most people don't have, formal surnames, when an author is writing and trying to tell you the difference between various people that are named Judas, they have to kind of explain, well, this one is Judas Iscariot and so forth, giving them a surname. While it's sometimes posited, so if we're thinking about, is Judas Iscariot a real figure? Is he a historical figure, or is he sort of a stand-in for the Jews in general, as I say, kind of a thing that early Christians are writing in order to blame their former co-religionists and to divide themselves from that as they are founding their own sort of new break-off religion, separating themselves in the first century. And so, like I say, sometimes because, again, the name Judas, is obviously related to the word Jew, sometimes people imagine then that, well, maybe this isn't even a real character, but he's just trying to assign blame in general to the Judeans, to Jews. But in contrast to that, the New Testament sources include lots of other folks named Judas, and they are viewed very positively. And so they haven't just simply said that name is something that we're blackening or anything like that. So for example, as we just have mentioned when we've done this list of the 12, there is a second apostle named Judas, who's simply referred to as the one that's not Judas the Iscariot, so it's not a terrible name to have. And there's a book of Jude in the New Testament, and Jude is simply another Greek rendering of Judas, so that's a brother of Jesus who is also named Judas and who is looked upon favorably enough to have a book named in his honor in the New Testament. So probably not, even though it's something that people have posited. The Synoptic Gospels give Judas the surname Iscariot to identify him from all these other Judases. And the most commonly accepted etymology for that name is that this is the Greek rendering of Iscariot, whatever the high Hebrew for meaning man from Kerioth. So in other words, that this is a place name. It's just like saying Jesus of Nazareth, he's from Nazareth. So this is Judas, the man from Kerioth. But that's not entirely certain, so there different etymologies are argued. So Josephus is talking a lot about this kind of group of brigands that are running around Judea that he calls Sicarii, which is a Latin name for brigand, and so it means dagger man. And so maybe it's a garbled Judas Sicarii, or Judas the Sicarius. I don't think that seems very likely, but in any event, is because Josephus is talking about Sicarii a lot, that's been suggested. And there's another idea that Iscariot is again kind of a Greek version for a Hebrew or Aramaic word that means the liar or the betrayer, and so that maybe that's simply where that kind of comes from. So those are other possibilities. It's most likely a place name, is what people think. Paul mentions his understanding that Jesus was betrayed. So that's a tradition that goes all the way back to, our earliest historical strata. But Paul doesn't say how that happened. The tradition of Judas as the betrayer, goes all the way back to the Gospel of Mark, and then is multiply attested. So it's also in John, in Acts, and other things. And so historians, including Bart Ehrman, who's skeptical of a lot of the historicity of the tradition, argue that Judas is among the more likely figures to have historicity, in part because, creating a story of Jesus being betrayed by somebody he had chosen as a close companion doesn't reflect well on Jesus. Jesus has sayings in the Gospels where after he calls the 12, he says that they will be reigning in a throne and being able to judge, essentially like in the afterlife, like the 12 tribes, symbolic 12 tribes. Why would he say that? Is pointing to people like including Judas, given that Judas isn't going to be among the 12 after the betrayal. He'll get replaced, according to Acts anyway. And so this is an argument that several historians anyway of the historical Jesus have that, in favor of Judas Iscariot's historicity as well. After betraying Jesus to the chief priests in Jerusalem in the Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, for 30 pieces of silver, we read that Judas regretted his actions. And so in Matthew chapter 27, it says, "Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, they led him away, and they handed him over to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. 'I have sinned,' he said, 'for I have betrayed innocent blood.' 'What is that to us?' they replied. 'That's your responsibility.' So they wouldn't take the money back, so Judas throws the money into the temple and he leaves, and then he went away and he hanged himself. So the chief priest picked up the coins and said, 'It's against the law to put this into the treasury since it's blood money.' So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me." So one of the things when we read Matthew and we're wondering where he is getting some sources for his narratives, when he then talks about it fulfilling a prophecy from the Old Testament, this is a clue to us of where this idea comes from. And so in any event, so what we're kind of going to find here maybe is that Matthew's reading anyway of Jeremiah may have influenced how he is creating or telling this narrative. So, but what we get in the Matthew account anyway in terms of the fate of Judas is that Judas throws the money away and then he hangs himself. So no mention is made of his remains, which presumably would be buried somewhere in the vicinity of Jerusalem. In other words, it's not saying that they buried him here in the field of blood. Rather, he went away and hanged himself, and the elders used the money that he threw away to themselves buy a field to bury foreigners. Judas isn't a foreigner. So the field of blood, like I say, they're bought by the priests with the money Judas returned, and so in some sense it's a memorial to him, but it's not necessarily, according to this account anyway, where he would be buried. So Matthew's account gives us our earliest description of the fate of any of the 12, and that would be probably therefore pretty good evidence anyway, because it's our earliest one. But we have an interesting situation because of the book of Acts. So the book of Acts of the Apostles, it records the deaths of just 2 of the 12, But one of these is again a death narrative for Judas Iscariot, and it gives us a different ending than what Matthew gave us. So we read in Acts chapter 1, now this man, Judas Iscariot, acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness. So he himself bought a field with the 30 pieces of silver. And then, falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all of his bowels gushed out. This became known to all the residents of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their language Hakeldama, that is, field of blood. So, in Acts then, Judas uses the rewards of his betrayal, the money, to purchase the field, and then later he has an accident. He falls and he dies while on the property. So interestingly then, these two stories directly contradict one another, and they really can't be reconciled. People who would like to believe that the Bible is literal and historically true and doesn't contradict itself make all kinds of gymnastics in order to reconcile these, but this is a direct contradiction. Both authors are aware of a tradition connecting Judas to a Jerusalem burial ground called the Field of Blood, but what's most likely happening here is that both authors are independently creating a fate for Judas based on that tradition and that text of Jeremiah that is discussing that same field as a burying ground in the earlier book, prophetic book of Jeremiah. So often the gospel writers, in creating and crafting their narratives, since they understand by their testimony that the whole of the Old Testament, that Jesus is a fulfillment of all of that, if they don't know details of something that's happening in Jesus' life, they can look to those and they can use that as a source of inspiration to fill in what they know must have happened. And so again, the Gospels are not histories, they are theological statements. All right, so let's look at where that field of blood is. Well, there's no generally acknowledged tomb of Judas Iscariot, so he's largely understood in Orthodox Christianity anyway, and modern Christianity to be a heretic and heresiarch, so a bad guy. There were ancient Christians like Gnostics and some who rehabilitated Judas, but they are not operating today. And so there's no acknowledged shrine for the tomb of Judas. However, there is a Greek Orthodox monastery built on the traditional site of the Field of Blood in Jerusalem. It's called the Monastery of St. Onofrius, and it celebrates and is the tomb of a 4th century desert father of the church, St. Onofrius. But in any event, that's where Judas, according to Acts anyway, would have died and probably be buried. Okay, after Judas, let's look at the next apostle that we can say to some effect has historicity. So with Peter and Judas, the apostle John is our best historically attested member of the 12, because once again, Paul mentions meeting John in Jerusalem, and he calls him an acknowledged pillar, and elsewhere one of the acknowledged leaders of the church. However, just as today, there were many people in antiquity named John. John is a very common name, and lots of them are in the biblical texts as well. And Christian tradition conflates many of these different Johns into the single figure, and we unpacked all of that in our lecture on who was John. And so among these, we have that historical disciple of Jesus that Paul claims to have met, a historical personage. We then have one of the 12, and one of the more important members of the 12 about whom there are stories in the Gospels and in Acts. We then have the idea that this anonymous beloved disciple in the 4th Gospel, the Gospel we call John, is this John character, although the text is very careful never to name him. We also have the idea that the author of the Gospel of John is named John, although it was an anonymous text. We also have the author of the book of Revelation, who does name himself as John, but is almost certainly a completely different character. We have the author or authors of the 3 epistles attributed to John in the New Testament. And in addition to that, in the early Christian tradition, there is a figure named John, known to an early bishop, Papias of Hierapolis in Anatolia. And we also have John, who is the teacher of another early bishop, Bishop of Smyrna in Anatolia, Polycarp. And so, anyway, there's a bunch of different Johns. Some of these might be the same, but others might be completely different. Like, for example, the author of Revelation, probably not the same as any of these. So, if we look at the letters, the Johannine letters, there's 3 letters attributed to John in the New Testament, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. 2nd John begins, "the elder to the lady chosen by God," and 3rd John begins, "the elder to my dear friend Gaius." And so neither of these begins, John the disciple of Jesus or John apostle of Jesus too, but rather the title this person is claiming is elder, which in Greek is presbyter, which we eventually understand a couple different ways in Christianity. So it's translated as elder, but it also evolves into priest. And so presbyter is a word we sometimes use, like Presbyterian, but we use both in my church, elder and priest, as different offices, even though it's emerging out of the same New Testament text, just because of translation issues and errors. So while the Johannine letters share themes with the 4th Gospel, most scholars identify them as the work of different authors, certainly anyway, the Gospel of John as multiple authors all by itself. So one of our earliest Christian authors who sought to collect early traditions was this guy Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis in Anatolia. And so Papias says that he questioned all kinds of old folks, aged informants, like a guy named John the Elder or John the Presbyter, and he asked them about their memories of the earliest apostles, including Peter. So although Papias' own books are lost, quotations of him survive in later writers, including Irenaeus, one of our earliest writers who writes a lot, so at the end of the 2nd century, and then Eusebius, the first major author who wants to write a whole history of early Christianity, but unfortunately writing much later in the 4th century. So Irenaeus calls Papias an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a friend of Polycarp. Irenaeus himself was a disciple of Polycarp, and he identifies Polycarp as a disciple of John. And Irenaeus believes that the John that his teacher was a disciple of was the apostle. But even if that's true, Papias, who is the older person who actually knew this John, he admits that he's talking to a different figure. He's not talking to John the apostle, he's talking to John the presbyter, the elder. In other words, just the same as what the author of these epistles of John is calling himself, the elder, not the apostle. So Papias writes, "If by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders arrived, I made inquiries about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said, or what Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew, or any of the Lord's disciples." So in other words, there's a whole list of apostles, including John. So he's asking the people he meets what John might have said, the apostle John. "And whatever Aristion and John the presbyter, the Lord's disciples, were saying, for I did not think that information from the books would profit me as much as information from living and surviving sources." So he wants oral tradition and hearsay, somebody who has heard directly from somebody. So if, for example, John the presbyter has a memory of having talked to one of these apostles, like John the apostle, Papias wants to talk to that guy. So it's a garbled quotation, but what it seems to be saying is that while Papias considers John the presbyter, who's an elder living in Ephesus, maybe as close to the year 100, while he calls them the Lord's disciples, he was asking him and others about testimony of disciples from the list of the 12. So that seems to indicate that Papias understands John the presbyter is a distinct person from John the apostle. So a fragment of Papias also preserves the idea that the apostle John was killed by Jewish authorities alongside his brother James. So it says John the theologian and James his brother were killed by Jewish authorities. And that is different from all other early traditions, including the tradition of Polycarp. So this idea that John the apostle dies a martyr's death is contradicted by the tradition of Irenaeus, himself a student of Polycarp, who was himself a student of someone named John, whom Irenaeus believes is John the apostle. So Irenaeus records that this John, whoever he was, died of natural causes around the year 98 or later. So based on the tradition that he remembers from his teacher Polycarp, Irenaeus says the church of Ephesus, founded by Paul with John continuing with them until the time of Trajan. And so since Trajan's reign begins in 98, that means in Irenaeus' understanding, John lived in Ephesus until at least the year 98. And like I say, he believes that to be John the Apostle. And so since tradition assumes that Polycarp's John is the historical apostle, I'm not convinced of that, the traditional tomb of the Apostle John is the Basilica of St. John in Ephesus. And so Ephesus is now in Turkey and is in ruins, but the Basilica of St. John in Ephesus, which is in ruins, near the town of Seljuk, Turkey, is the traditional resting place then for the Apostle John. And like I say, even though there's reason to believe that we may be talking about a different John than John the Apostle, and so therefore this wouldn't be where the historical apostle is, this is our most likely traditional tomb, or I'm sorry, of the traditional tombs, this one has the most possibility of being historically accurate of any of them other than Peter. And so it's like Peter, then John, then Judas maybe. And so we have then as we're starting down our list, we have the idea that Peter is in Rome at the Vatican, John is in Ephesus, and Judas Iscariot is outside of Jerusalem or in Jerusalem at the field of blood. All right, so let's look at some of the rest of the apostles that we are going to have less and less historical information for as we go along. So the next one I want to look at is James the Great, as he's called, to differentiate himself from another James on the list, and the tradition that he is buried at Santiago de Compostela. So in northwestern Spain, in the capital of Galicia, in Santiago de Compostela, there's a cathedral with a shrine and a tomb of Santiago. So as early as the 11th century, pilgrims from all the way around Western Europe, from across the Pyrenees, made their way to this shrine, introducing this tradition of the Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James, which continues to this day, attracting some 200,000 pilgrims per year. And so this is one of the paths that you can take, one of them that's connecting you to France, all across northern Spain. They're lined with these shells, and there's traditional, because of the big pilgrimage business in the Middle Ages, there are beautiful churches that line this historic churches that you can visit all along the way, and it's also continues to be an important spiritual practice, and also for even secular people who want to commune with the universe, or however they're understanding truth and so forth. The original attraction on the pilgrimage route is the tomb of Santiago the Apostle. That is, Santiago is the Galician for St. Jacob, And in English, we render Jacob as St. James. And so again, this is the tomb of St. James called the Great to differentiate him from the other St. Jameses. According to the lists of the 12 in the Synoptic Gospels, James, son of Zebedee, is one of two of the 12 apostles named James, the other being the son of Alphaeus, and those are thus James the Great, son of Zebedee, and James the Less, son of Alphaeus. Besides the contradictory stories given for Judas' death, the only member of the 12, as I mentioned, whose fate is recorded in the New Testament at all is James the Great. And this is a really brief mention in Acts chapter 12. We read there, about that time, King Herod, and this is a different Herod than Herod the Great at the time that Jesus is born. This is King Herod Antipas. King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John, killed with a sword, and he also saw that it pleased the Jews, so he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So we just have the idea that James is killed by King Herod, but we don't have any more details. So if he's killed then in Judea, how does his body get to Galicia, we ask? So the tradition of the movement of the body of James the Great from Judea anyway to Galicia is surprisingly late to my thinking, considering how important the pilgrimage site is, and it's also pretty unlikely. So according to medieval Galicians, James's body was taken by angels who sailed on a rudderless, unattended boat, and it sailed providentially all the way to Galicia, where then he was entombed. That tomb was lost, but was subsequently rediscovered in the year 814 by Pelagius the Hermit. Again, we might just ask, how do you know that who it is, and things like that. But Pelagius, it's providence and revelation that's helping them to decide who the body is or what the relics are. So Bishop Theodomyrus of Iria told King Alfonso II of Asturias and Galicia about this great find, and a shrine is built to welcome pilgrims. So one of the reasons all of these traditions start to happen is that there is a great spiritual need for intercession. People would like to be able to communicate with God, and having an intercessor, having someone who is important and lived this incredible life, like according to tradition, one of the 12 apostles will have done. Wanting to go there and particularly ask for intercession is the kind of thing that's modeling on regular medieval life, when you might ask a major landowner to bring a petition to the king so that you can have justice and so forth. People who have done something terrible and they need to reboot their life, they can go on a major pilgrimage to show that that they really are serious about starting over. There are all kinds of social reasons that this really worked, but it also is a lucrative business because this is the invention essentially of Western tourism. And one of the things that happens with tourism is that tourists bring money and help your economy. And so pilgrims were also bringing money. They were giving alms to the different shrines and so forth. So later, after they have found this, later legends started to be created to talk about how, okay, it wasn't just a coincidence that this boat, happened to bring them here, but there later became an idea or a tradition that St. James had been a Christian missionary who went to Galicia before he went back and got executed in the book of Acts. But there are no sources for any such tradition like that earlier than the 700s. And so it's an old tradition, but we can pretty well say that this is without any historical basis. Nevertheless, even though there aren't any ancient associations in Galicia with St. James, finding his tomb really, like I say, fits the period that it's found in. Western Christians, when they began rebuilding after serious decline in the early Middle Ages, there was more capacity to do things. Relics and body of saints, they were essential for the church's holiness. but also for people who, like I say, needed some kind of a major life reset or a major favor from God, or who needed healing. So as a result of that, different churches competed to buy, create, or even steal relics. And so, for example, here's a picture of St. Mark's in Venice, and the Venetians fairly famously stole the body of St. Mark's which was understood traditionally to be in Alexandria. St. Mark, the evangelist, is traditionally anyway understood to have been the founder of the line of the popes or patriarchs of Alexandria. And so the Venetians in the Middle Ages stole those relics and took them to their cathedral in order to have an important early saint to kind of be protecting their city and their republic. And that's why the flag of Venice even has the winged lion of St. Mark on the flag. So in other words, it seems a little bit crazy to us and impious to actually steal relics, and that's somehow going to be a good thing, since it is but people will justify it in all kinds of different ways, like that that even though that was being housed by the Coptic Egyptian church, that they were under the control of a Muslim sultan, and so therefore they needed to liberate the relics or something like that. They will have justified it, but in any event, once St. Mark's body is there in the new basilica, then again pilgrims will come and also make donations to support the worship of the saint there, or veneration of the saint there, not worship. Okay, so like I say, non-historians may respond, the fact that none of the sources and the artifacts show that, for Galicia shows any associations with St. James, obviously that doesn't prove that angels couldn't have brought the body there in a rudderless boat. And so they can believe that that's the actual body. But like I say, there's no basis historically to say that. But the non-historicity of the tomb, I think, doesn't detract from the living, millennium-long tradition of hiking the Camino de Santiago. And like I say, this continues to be an important and moving spiritual practice that has the potential to be a very meaningful, once-in-a-lifetime experience that connects you with fellow pilgrims, with friends, with yourself, with historical roots, with people of the past, with the divine, with God, however you might choose to live that. I have a good friend who just barely did part of the Camino, or did one of the Camino tracks as kind of an incredible spiritual experience at a change of life, and it was incredibly meaningful to her. All right, so we have ideas that Peter is in Rome, John is in Ephesus, Judas in Jerusalem, and a tradition anyway that James the Greater is in Santiago. Obviously, he might also be someplace around Jerusalem based on the account in Acts. Let's move on now to Thomas. Thomas means twin in Aramaic, and he's sometimes also given the Greek name Didymus, and that also means Greek, so he's sometimes called Didymus Thomas, Thomas the twin. Thomas is also known as the apostle in the Gospel of John, who initially doubts that Jesus has been resurrected because he hasn't had the vision of it himself, and so he won't believe it until he himself has thrust his fingers into Jesus's wounds and so forth. So he's called Doubting Thomas. And some scholars have argued or speculated that this may reflect the Johannine community's disagreements with ideas held by other early Christian communities that claimed Thomas as their authority. And so if, for example, a proto-Gnostic community is suggesting that the Apostle Thomas actually had important secret teachings that hadn't been given to Peter and so on, that the Gospel of John might be saying, well, this guy didn't even believe that Jesus was resurrected. How can you trust any secret teaching by him? So that's one possibility of why he's maybe denigrated in that sense in the Gospel of John, to the extent that he is. We also know that Thomas is looked on that way in communities, proto-Gnostic communities, and later the Gnostic communities. We have the manuscript of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas that was refound in the 20th century. It's a sayings gospel attributed to Thomas and is among the most important Christian texts that did not make it into the canon. It begins in its present form with the preface, "These are the hidden words that the living Jesus spoke to Didymus Judas Thomas, and he wrote them down." And so that gives them the idea that, again, this Thomas, he's Thomas the twin. And the idea here, again, is that he is another one of these guys named Judas. And we're differentiating him by, he's not Judas the Iscariot, but he's Judas the twin. Gnostic Christians kept the text, and they later understood Thomas to be the twin of Jesus in the kind of divine sense that Greek mythology often had, where there is a kind of a fully divine twin and then a human twin, like Castor and Pollux, or the more divine or semi-divine Hercules and his more mortal brother. So he had a twin brother. And so the idea then in Gnosticism, as this developed anyway, is that Thomas is a twin that looks just like Jesus, but he's the human one and Jesus is the divine one. Again, this is an idea that's not in the canonical Gospels. Christian tradition associates Thomas with a wide-ranging mission to the East, and especially to India. And so within India, in the province of Kerala, which is down at the southwestern coast of India, is a Christian community that may date as early as the 3rd century. And so today they're known as St. Thomas Christians because they believe that Thomas himself was their founder. That's their tradition. And also in India is the Cathedral Basilica of St. Thomas in the Santhome neighborhood of Chennai. That is what used to be the city of Madras in India. And so within that cathedral basilica is the traditional tomb of Thomas the Apostle. But there are various repositories for Thomas's relics that are all over the place, in part because of the tradition of him traveling so widely. And so one of those places is the city of Edessa, which is an important early Christian center, and it was also the center of one of the Crusader states, now in modern Turkey, and so now in an area that is all Muslim. And so at some point or other, I think maybe during the Crusades, a tombstone from Edessa was relocated by the Crusaders to Ortona, Italy, and that's one of the places where some of Thomas's relics are traditionally understood to be, but there are also shrines everywhere from India to Syria, Greece, Turkey, Italy. Even the Netherlands claims to have various relics of Thomas. So primarily in India, but also Edessa, Greece, and more. Let's go to Andrew, Peter's brother. He is primarily known as the brother of Simon, which is the person renamed by Jesus, Peter. The brothers were fishermen from the town of Bethsaida in Galilee, which was a mixed region that was highlighted by the fact that Andrew's name is Greek, not Hebrew, like his brother Simon. Jesus calls the brothers from their fishing nets, saying in the Gospel of Mark, "I will make you fishers of men. I will teach you to fish for people." In the rest of the Gospels, then, Andrew fades into the background as Peter essentially takes the spotlight. And so we have to turn to tradition to find out anything more about him. In the late 2nd century, Andrew inspired an apocryphal text, the Acts of Andrew, which states that he was martyred in the city of Patras in the Peloponnese, at the top of the Peloponnese you can see in a modern map of Greece. So while that book is lost, it was still available to some of the medieval writers like Gregory of Tours, who had access to it and quoted from it, so we have a little bit of it preserved. Andrew's primary crypt, as we said, is in the city of Amalfi, which I visited a couple of months ago. And we might ask, how did he end up making it to there? So one of the famous things about Andrew is this idea that he is crucified on a diagonal cross, or a cross in the form of an X. And of course that inspires the flag of Scotland, which is maybe known as a blue field with a white X across it, which is understanding this tradition. So nevertheless, though, the tradition that he, like his brother Peter, who asked to be crucified upside down, the idea was that Peter and Andrew felt they were unworthy to be crucified in the exact same manner of Jesus, and so therefore he was crucified on a sideways cross. In Andrew's case especially, this is a tradition that only developed in the later Middle Ages. We have all sorts of early iconography of him just being crucified like normal. But like I say, how did Andrew's traditional relics make their way from Patras, where he is supposedly crucified according to the Acts of Andrew, which are themselves already a 2nd century apocryphal source? How did they make it to Amalfi? Well, when Constantine refounds the city of Byzantium as Constantinople, as the new Rome, the imperial capital, memorials and relics from all across the Eastern Empire were collected and brought to the city to make it beautiful. And these included the traditional relics of Andrew the Apostle, which were translated or moved from Patras to a huge new church in Constantinople, the Church of the Holy Apostles. So that church has subsequently been destroyed. It was in really poor repair as of the Ottoman conquest and eventually torn down. But we can kind of see a medieval picture of what it would have looked like with its multiple domes here in a medieval illuminated manuscript of it. So having within the city of Constantinople the relics of this apostle, the brother of Andrew, was obviously a meaningful thing for the patriarchs, the bishops of Constantinople. Here they were a new Rome, and they were the heirs of St. Andrew in the same way that the bishops of Rome understood themselves to be the heirs of Andrew's brother, Peter. And so as a result, that's how patriarchs of Constantinople, the leaders, the ecumenical leaders of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, continued to consider themselves. However, unfortunately, when the forces of the Fourth Crusade were diverted from their attempt to retake the Holy Land and attack enemies of the faith in the terms of the conflict between Muslims and Christians, and they instead attacked and sacked the city of Constantinople for the very first time in its history. And so when that happened, relics were among the vast treasures looted by the Latins who brought things back to the West. These included the relics of St. Andrew. So you can see on the map here of the medieval city of Constantinople, where the Church of the Holy Apostles was, where the relics were kept. So the papal legate, who was essentially the ambassador from the Pope to the Crusaders and the Crusader leaders, was a nobleman from the town of Amalfi, from the city of Amalfi, and in the midst of the aftermath of the sack, he bought St. Andrew's relics, which he brought home to Amalfi, and that became a pilgrimage center then in the rebuilt cathedral of Matthew there. And so that's why Andrew's relics are possibly in Amalfi, possibly in Patras, but in fact, to the tradition again is not unlikely to have the historical Andrew in either of those places. So we're halfway through. The other ones will go faster because the traditions, the historicity is less and less, and the traditions are a little more wild. So Philip the Apostle, with Philip we come to apostles with some New Testament stories. Like John's Gospel states that he's from Bethsaida. Like Andrew and Peter, he attends the wedding at Cana. Jesus asks Philip how to feed the 5,000 people. And at the Last Supper, Philip asks Jesus to show them the Father. Nevertheless, John is the least historical gospel, and so Philip's role here is probably literary. We don't really know. Philip figures in apocryphal texts, including a late 2nd century letter from Peter to Philip, and a 4th century Gnostic gospel that purports to tell the acts of Philip, in which Philip has a magic duel with the sorcerers of Pharaoh before getting beheaded. Other later traditions have him crucified upside down like Peter, and his remains are supposedly in Rome in the Basilica of the Holy Apostles. But another traditional tomb of Philip is found in that same Hierapolis in now what is now modern-day Turkey that our old friend Papias was bishop of way back in the 1st century or early 2nd century. Let's go on to another one. So there's an apostle called Simon, who is not the same as Simon Peter, and possibly is meant to be called something like Simon the Zealous. So as we said, Peter's original name was Simon, and to differentiate a second Simon within the 12, the gospel writers have given him a surname. It's related to the Hebrew word kanai, meaning zealous. So in Mark and Matthew, they render this word in Greek in such a way to mean Canaanian or Canaanite. But this is kind of an anachronism, because the Canaanites is an older name for the people who are not worshipers of Yahweh, who are not worshipers of the God of Israel, but who are the neighbors that are intermixed among the tribes of Israel. Normally in the New Testament, they'll call these guys Syro-Phoenicians or Syrians, but in any event, it's not clear what that would mean, since Simon is an Israelite, so, or at least he's a believer in that. So maybe it's a person who has converted, but we don't have any sense of that. In Luke and Acts, this word has been read to mean Simon the Zealot. And so again, the word Canaanite is related to a word meaning zealous, and same thing, the word zealot. But zealot is a kind of a political movement that we read about from Josephus again, that probably is active, a couple decades or a few decades after the historical Jesus, when his apostles would have lived. So again, both of these, if he's Simon the Canaanite or Simon the Zealot, are both probably anachronistic. And so some folks have argued, well, maybe it really should just mean Simon the Zealous. But in any event, he's called Simon the Zealot or Simon the Zealous Canaanite, Zealot Canaanite. So let's look at the traditions. He doesn't have any biblical stories, but he is in the Arabic infancy gospel, which is a very late pseudepigraphic source, where he appears as a child who is bitten by a snake, and then he's healed by the little boy Jesus, who goes on to predict that he will in the future be his disciple. So that's just one of the things that happens in infancy gospels. Later traditions have Simon teamed up with Jude the apostle as they go around as an evangelizing team by twos. They travel in some of the sources through Egypt, Syria, Persia, Armenia, Georgia, and so forth. I mentioned that Simon's attribute is a saw, and you can see it here in this statue of him where he's holding a big saw. And this is because some of the traditions, while some of the traditions have him crucified while serving as a bishop of Jerusalem or dying in Edessa, others record that while he's either in Persia or Georgia, even Britain in some stories, he's sawed in half, and therefore his traditional attribute artwork is holding a saw. It's a very grisly end for Simon in some of these traditions anyway. There are competing tombs in Georgia, in Rome, in Toulouse, and other locations for Simon. If we go on to now Matthew, the gospel attributed to Matthew was in fact an anonymous text written by a Jewish Christian around the 80s AD. The superscript or title, according to Matthew, was added though in the hundreds, so in the 2nd century. And again, our friend Papias of Hierapolis has a confusing statement, as all of his tend to be, that leads to an erroneous belief that the text was the first gospel and that it was originally written in Aramaic. Linguistic analysis shows that the text was composed in Greek, and again, the first gospel is Mark, almost certainly. And so Matthew is making use of that. But anyway, that's one of the reasons why we have this idea of Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, as an evangelist. There are no stories in the Gospel of Mark about Matthew, about the Matthew that Mark includes on his list of apostles. Mark does tell a brief story of Jesus interacting with a tax collector named Levi, son of Alphaeus. And then, in the Gospel of Matthew, who, as I say, is using Mark as a source, that story is repurposed, and the name Levi is crossed out, and the Gospel calls that person Matthew. And so, as a result of that, tradition, in order to explain that, tradition conflates Matthew and Levi and just understands them as two names for the same person. So, as we saw, and we just visited the crypt of the Apostle Matthew in Salerno. So how does Matthew get to Salerno? So tradition, that's again very late, has Matthew martyred in Asia or Ethiopia, sometimes among cannibals, and where once he's dead, supposedly his remains are found by ancient merchants from Brittany, Bretons, who take his relics to Lyon, Brittany, still in antiquity while the Roman Empire is around, or as it's collapsing. And so in the 5th century, according to this tradition, a Roman prefect transfers them from Brittany to Campania, the area around Salerno, the area around Naples, where they were then lost until again being miraculously rediscovered in 954. So once again, this, I think, like the Santiago story, is just incredibly, unlikely in every one of its parts, and it relies on a miraculous rediscovery a century after the remains are not known to be there. But at least, unlike with Andrew and Constantinople, no Christian cities were sacked in the creating of this particular tradition. And so now we can see, out of our 12, we have the 9 of the apostles in places like Rome, Ephesus, Jerusalem, Santiago, India, Amalfi, Rome, maybe though other places, and Salerno. Let's go to James the Less. So as cool as it would be to be one of the apostles of Jesus, it seems less great if you're primarily known for being less than the other apostle, James. So even this is a conflation. So the apostle James, the son of Alphaeus, has been traditionally identified with another James, James the Less, who is a character in the Bible who is listed as being the son of the disciple named Mary. And so it's unlikely that James the Less actually is James the son of Alphaeus, who is the lesser of the 2 James apostles. But James the Less is even less than that. However, because of how tradition is constantly conflating everybody, James the Less and James the son of Alphaeus are conflated, just like different Marys are all conflated. Mark talks about a publican named Levi, as we were saying, who is also said to be a son of Alphaeus. And because that Levi, the tax collector, the publican, is conflated with the apostle Matthew, that makes, by a transitive property, that James the Less is Matthew's brother. They're all the sons of Alphaeus once you make all these conflations. So while there's no biblical stories about James the son of Alphaeus or James the Less, later tradition, much later, puts his ministry in Egypt, and it states that he was crucified in an Egyptian port called Ostrakine, which is kind of on the coast in the direction of Judea. As if being known as James the Less isn't bad enough. If you're where does he end up? Western tradition in Compostela anyway has James the Less just buried along with Santiago, James the Great in the cathedral that is primarily known for housing James the Great. And it's just like, oh, by chance we also have the other James too. By contrast, another tradition in the West has him in the Basilica of the Holy Apostles in Rome, where it's a repository for kind of leftover apostle relics and things like that, as opposed to the biggies like Peter and Paul. But a more kind tradition, I think anyway, because he gets his own tradition, is in the Armenian Orthodox Church, where their cathedral in Jerusalem houses St. James the Less, and so it's called the Armenian Cathedral of St. James in Jerusalem. Again, there aren't any biblical stories for Bartholomew the Apostle. His name in Aramaic means son of Talmai, so in the same way that we think of the Hebrew names where you have Ben, Gavin or whatever, Ben means son of. In Aramaic, that's Bar. In Arabic, it's Ibn. Those are, patronymics where you're saying who's the son of. And so Bartholomew, because we have a name of a different apostle in John, Nathaniel, Bartholomew by tradition gets conflated with him. And so as tradition talks about what does Bartholomew / Nathaniel do, they assign his mission sometimes to Armenia, sometimes to India, sometimes to Arabia and Ethiopia. And again, there are a number of competing shrines that claim to house his relics. Greek Orthodox tradition holds that Bartholomew is buried in a town called Daras in Mesopotamia, now part of Turkey. The Latin traditions located him in little islands off of Sicily, Lipari, with his body then being washed ashore into Italy itself before being transferred to Benevento, one of those Lombard principalities in the Middle Ages. And then when the German emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, came down into Italy and visited Benevento, he took the skull back with him to Germany, where it is in Frankfurt. And then additional relics of Bartholomew are said to be on the Church of San Bartholomew al Desola on the Tiber Island, a beautiful place in the river next to Rome. But Armenian Orthodox tradition states that both the apostles Thaddeus and Bartholomew were the ones who brought Christianity to Armenia. And that tradition also says that Armenia became the first state to adopt Christianity as its official religion, predating the Roman Empire by a few years. And it also says that Bartholomew was martyred at a site where the St. Bartholomew Monastery was built in an area of ancient Armenia southeast of Lake Van. And that had survived up until 1915, when the monastery had to be abandoned and was partially destroyed during the genocide in 1915. So these are pictures, it survived enough to be photographed. It's kind of in ruins at this point. Like Bartholomew the Apostle, Thaddeus is a patron of the Armenian Apostolic Church, and Armenian tradition holds that Thaddeus is buried in a monastery named in his honor. This one is now located in modern Iran. Luke, of course, omitted Thaddeus from the list of the 12 and replaced him with a certain Judas, son of James, so in other words, a second Judas. And so tradition conflates the two as Jude Thaddeus. And later tradition wrongly conflates all of these with Jude, the brother of James, and James, the brother of Jesus, to create then Jude Thaddeus, brother of Jesus. So like I say, tradition is conflating all these characters together all the time. So in an alternate Western traditions, unlike the Armenian tradition, Jude Thaddeus is said to have been martyred in Beirut in Lebanon, after which his body is brought to be Rome, where it's understood to be buried in the Vatican. And so that brings us, more or less to our list of the 12, where we have people buried all over the place, according to tradition anyway, but the tradition becomes decreasingly likely and ever more unlikely, as we go all the way through to lesser known apostles who in some cases are just names and are not even consistent among the Gospels. We have only the one left here, which is in the book of Acts, Judas's replacement, Matthias. So once again, there's really no biblical stories. All of our traditions are late, vague, and contradictory. So he's alternatively said to have been martyred in Jerusalem or Ethiopia, Egypt, or Georgia. And so once again, we have multiple claims to house his relics. There's a beautiful abbey in Padua, which claims to house his relics. It's also said that he was martyred in Judea, and Constantine's mother, St. Helena, found the relics and then brought them to Rome, where they're housed in the Basilica of St. Mary Major, after which the emperor moved some of them to the ancient military capital at the time, Augustum Treverii, the city of Trier in Germany, and you can see St. Matthias Abbey in Trier. But other traditions state that he's buried in Sebastopolis, which is now the largest city in the breakaway region of Georgia, Abkhazia, or another city in Georgia, Apsaros, now Gonio in Georgia. And so that fills out, kind of our answer to the question, where are the 12 apostles? And also, I think, how good are any of these traditions? And so what I'll say is that really, after, just the first few, there's a chance that, a pretty good chance that Peter made it to Rome, and that may be where he's buried. The tradition doesn't quite meet history, but it gets as close as you can. We have a tradition that there's an important early John that is buried in Ephesus, that within a second century tradition is still the Apostle John. We have two different accounts that Judas, who's probably a historical figure, is associated with this field in Jerusalem. But then, ever thereafter, the traditions are much later and less likely or completely unlikely as we get through some of them. Nevertheless, they're often very ancient traditions, or at least medieval traditions that have been around for a long time, and in many cases preserve very special traditions and incredibly beautiful shrines that were well worth visiting. And so, in addition to the ones that we just barely saw in Amalfi and Salerno, I'm intending to seek out many more of these and go find them. And I certainly want, especially at some point, to be able to go to Santiago on the Camino to the shrine for St. James the Greater. So that is my take on what happened to the 12 apostles. And I'm going to get a glass of water as Leandro gathers your questions. Okay, so thank you so much, Anders and Alistair. Thanks for your support. We really appreciate that. Todd Radmaker says, what does Paul mean by being untimely born? So what I'm saying is that, I think in this way is that he is saying that he wasn't able to actually be born at the same time as some of these other apostles that he's met, who he then had been in a position where he could become a disciple of Jesus during his earthly ministry, but only encounters Jesus, the risen Christ, in a visionary conversion experience that he describes. And so it's an untimely birth, but he's also trying to explain that his conversion here was very stark, because he is going from somebody who had been raised as a Pharisee and who saw the disciples of Jesus as being heretics and something to be eradicated, before having this profound conversion experience. And so I think he's trying to say that it's an untimely birth here in order to make a very stark statement about that transition. He is a real convert, and then has the zeal of a convert. I Was Never Here says, what is John's opinion on some scholarship interpreting the letter of Clement, 1 Clement 5:5-7, talking about internal Christian conflicts killed Peter and Paul? And so what that reads in 1 Clement, it says, through envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church have been persecuted and put to death. And then it also says in 1 Clement 5:4 and 5:5, Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors, and then owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance. So it's interesting, right? So this is an idea. It's attributing them being martyred to envy through envy and jealousy, right? And so it's not conclusive, but it's suggestive evidence. But it's an interesting point, right? And so we've talked before in our our different lectures on Paul and why Paul's churches won and so forth. We've talked about the possibility that that Paul, in the end, is seeing himself and what he's doing as being in conflict with the church that's being led by James. And we've talked about the possibility that that Paul is set up when he goes to Jerusalem in order to give this collection that he's taken up for the poor of Jerusalem, for the Church of James, and that possibly he's believed that he could be brought with some of the other disciples there and they could enter the temple, but that once he was there, because he hasn't been keeping the law and that has been found out, he is arrested and that ultimately leads to his execution, if he indeed is executed by Roman authorities outside the walls, where Paul outside the walls church is today. And so, I mean, an argument could be made in that case that is, an internal conflict within Christianity that Paul got set up. But again, you can build that set of surmise, and you could say possibly that's what happened, but we really can't say that conclusively. In other words, this is interesting and suggestive, but we can't know for sure, is what I would say. Felix Fortuna Rex says, is there any known reason why Jesus gave keys to Peter instead of another? So again, this is a statement that exists only in the Gospel of Matthew. So when we are trying to look at authentic sayings of the historical Jesus, one of the things that we like to do is to find sayings with multiple attestation. So if there is a saying within the tradition that comes through multiple independent sources, like the last shall be first and the first shall be last, which has a lot of different varieties in the different Gospels and other texts, or knock and it shall be opened to you, and that kind of thing. That's in multiple different portions of the tradition. Then a lot of those are seen as more likely to be authentic and going all the way back to Jesus in an authentic tradition. Another way is if it's a kind of a pithy thing that's easy to remember, or something that doesn't apply to later Christianity, and it actually is uncomfortable for later Christianity, and so therefore might more readily apply to the historical Jesus and the Jesus movement of the time. And so this is coming only from Matthew. And what Matthew says is, thou art Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and what you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven, and so forth. The fact that he says, upon this rock I will build my church, this already is implying that this is an anachronistic statement, because this is different from what Jesus is doing with his own movement, and instead it's dating from a time when there's starting to exist to be a church, and we need to have authority. And so this is a tradition that's existing within the Matthean community and not anywhere else, not known with any of the other communities, and it's essentially arguing that community, which sees Peter as its patron, has authority, and that the successors of that community and the successors of Peter have that authority. So why does Jesus say it? He says it because later Christians who want to understand how to operate as a church in this kind of chaotic movement attribute that kind of a saying to Jesus in order to create that authority. So I would suggest that I think it's unlikely that that's a statement that the historical Jesus would have said. K. Tempest Bradford says, isn't there a theory that St. Mark's body was actually Alexander's body? Andrew, could you scroll down? Oh, yeah. We're at the K. Tempest Bradford part. Okay, yeah, so that's the first one. And so, yes, there is a kind of a modern theory that is speculating that. And so the thing about it is there's a very important, Alexander had a very important tomb. One of the, so there was a huge succession crisis at the end of Alexander's kind of untimely death that ultimately resulted in his generals taking over. But one of the smartest of his generals, Ptolemy, was smart enough not only to make a beeline and run straight for Egypt, which was the most easily governable and richest section of the empire that you could maybe set up a kingdom in, but also to grab Alexander's body, so that you have some of the legitimacy to it. And so then he created one of the major shrines of the Hellenistic world. But that tomb itself disappeared, and so because that disappeared, some recent guys have kind of speculated, well, maybe what the Venetians were getting was actually that tomb. I think that that's really unlikely. So I think that there's all kinds of, this is in some ways, Alexandria is always burning, the library is always burning down. Everyone's always trying to find the different shrines and associate any number of the things. I think that by the time we're getting to the Middle Ages, a pagan tomb will have been already destroyed by either the Christians or the Muslims who have been ruling there, and possibly even robbed by previous pagans and so forth. So I think it's pretty unlikely. Whether the Venetians actually got a hold of St. Mark, whether St. Mark is actually, again, the Gospel of Mark is itself anonymous. All of the traditions associating with Mark are late. So whether there was an original bishop of Alexandria or Pope of Alexandria named Mark is also, we don't really have great historical basis for that. It's a tradition. So it's probably not, I would say may not be Mark, probably not Mark, and it's probably almost certainly not Alexander. Transformation Gaming, thanks for your support. Transformation Gaming asks, do you think, oh wait, there's another K. Tempest. Oh, I see. No, we're doing I see. Transformation Gaming asks, do you think the apostles would appreciate being viewed as a martyr after death? I think they would be offended because they sold out for Jesus and the church instead of set their hearts on man and not the kingdom of God. So the question I think is becoming a martyr what anybody was thinking about and going for at the earliest level, right? And so later, by the time you're getting to the second and third centuries, martyrdom is something that Christians are looking at as a very noble thing because they've been facing occasional and sometimes severe persecutions where not all the time, but sometimes Christians are being thrown to the lions and that kind of thing, and people are looking at people who have that level of faith as expressing incredible spiritual power on the one hand, but also essentially taking up their cross and following the path of Jesus, who was himself martyred. And so certainly by the time we're getting to when the sources are being written and the sources of Christian tradition are being written, especially in the second and third centuries, martyrdom is seen as a really good thing, although you're not supposed to seek martyrdom. But if you do get martyred, then that's more or less your calling and election is made sure. The question is, does that exist at the earliest level? And I think that there might be some arguments that it does, because even within some of our earliest Jesus teachings, the teachings that are found in the Q sayings source that both the authors of Luke and Matthew are using, are talking about the martyrs, John the Baptist and Jesus and the other prophets, sealing their testimony in blood. And there's also the statement of taking up your cross. And so I think that there may be a sense early on that if you did get martyred for this, that's a good thing. There's also they're also working with Old Testament and actually Second Temple period texts like the book of Maccabees. So in the book of Maccabees, there's the 7 martyred sons and their mother, and those are who all die for their faith. And so those are also seen as exemplary models, both in non-Christian Judaism and in Christianity. So I do think that they feel that way, although I don't think that so I think that the tradition that all of these apostles got martyred, except for maybe John the Beloved, I think that that's something that later tradition has assigned to them, and it's unlikely that they all did get killed for their beliefs, all the 12 apostles, to the extent that we even know what the historical 12's names even are. A lot of them probably died of old age and other illnesses and things like that, and not being martyred. But tradition assigns them all, except for John, and even in some cases, in some versions, John, a martyr's death, because that became what was expected in later tradition. Stories by Steve. Thank you for your support. Stories by Steve says, "You do great research. My wife and I started watching you a few years ago. Many thanks for your work. You really explain Bible and history well." Oh, well, thank you so much, Stories by Steve. I also appreciate that you and your wife are finding these discussions helpful, and we, like I say, very thankful for your support. K. Tempest Bradford asks, "Has anyone ever tried to open any of these tombs and check inside them?" And then Fire Ever Living answered that and said, "They exhumed the alleged St. Peter, but it was a whole mess where they lost track of the body for a while, so we're not even 100% sure that the body we have was in the original tomb." Leandro also wrote me to try to clear this up. He says that the Vatican excavated under St. Peter's in the 20th century. They found early shrine and bones, though even the Vatican admitted certainty was impossible. So archaeology can confirm that there was a site that was venerated early. Like I say, we know from our historical sources that as of the year 200, people understood that was where St. Peter was buried. But you can't prove, even if you can prove that there was a guy who was around 50 who died around the year 50. In other words, you can't prove that that's Peter because we can't do any DNA matching. We don't have any DNA to match to. And so again, all of the so all of that has to remain speculative, right? So that's why I just wanted to connect what is the earliest form of the tradition that we can actually where we can cite the tradition, and so we can say we had that tradition kind of formed by 200, and then we can look at, well, where do we leave off with Peter as a historical figure, and we leave off with him around the 50s. And so, we're not sure, in between there, that we can connect those two. Pugles 125, thank you for your support. Puglies. Thanks again. Devin Atkins says, "I know the church has the 12. Are there more apostles recognized?" So there are. I mean, like I mentioned, Devin, there are other apostles who are biblical, because Paul, in the letter to Romans, cites 2 people who he calls apostles, and he even says that they are renowned among the apostles. So that is Andronicus and Junia. We have the 12 that are listed in the Gospels. We have a 13th one because of, in Acts, Matthias is done, and we also have Paul, who is That would be 14, 15, 16. So we have biblically 16 named apostles. But in the Gospel of Luke, we have another whole narrative about additional disciples, they say. But essentially, after Jesus calls 12 disciples and sends them out, then there's more work that needs to be done. So then what happens is that Jesus calls 70 or 72 more and sends them out. And so those are also understood to be another 72 apostles. And so that's why, according to tradition anyway, when we're talking about, let's say, Luke, who's not one of the 12 apostles, or Mark, who's not one of the 12 apostles, those are understood to be 2 of the 70 apostles according to tradition. And so tradition, and the church recognize that there's many more than 12 apostles, and tradition especially assigns, let's say, the major ones in the Bible, they often get called the 70, among the 70 or 72 apostles. Darther Emma says, there seems to be so little info on the earliest Christian churches in Rome. Are there reference materials you can suggest? So there we have, some references to Rome. The best for the earliest description is, of course, Paul's letter to the Romans themselves. So that is indicating that there is a very significant and very early group of Christians that are already there by the time Paul is writing. And again, he hasn't been there, he didn't found it, and none of the known apostles, none of the 12 apostles did. Paul lists 2 additional apostles who aren't part of the 12 who are there and who are helping found that. So the Epistle to Romans is the very first thing and earliest that's important. We also have the letter 1 Clement, which is, it's called 1 Clement because there's a second apocryphal letter that's not written by Clement, but Clement of Rome, writing in the end of the 1st century, so one of our very earliest Christian texts that don't make it into the New Testament, talks about his own Roman church, as he's also discussing, he's writing a letter to the Corinthian church, so he's also discussing how the church is operating there. And so that gives us a little bit of a snapshot to how the church is emerging. We have an important book that also didn't make it into the New Testament called The Shepherd of Hermas, which is a longer book that we've done a lecture on and that you can look up, but it's also worth a read. And Ignatius of Antioch, a very early Christian writer, has a letter that he writes to the Romans, so he's from Antioch writing that. And there are some other early texts. So the non-Christian source Tacitus talks a little bit about the Christians in Rome. He more or less says Christianity is a horrible deluded cult that comes from the East, but everything that's every crazy thing ends up in the Rome, and so obviously this had to come here too. So he says things like that. And then we also have other early writers like Justin Martyr, who is talking about talks about the church itself. So it is a little bit few and far between. But we do have enough contemporary early writings from the 1st century and then the early 2nd century in Rome that lead us to sort of believe that that there isn't a really strong idea that a single bishop was leading the community as early as when Peter would have been there if he ever got there. And so that's why we have a whole kind of lecture on, was Peter the first pope, that is also kind of examining, kind of the development of the early church in the city of Rome. Okay, folks, thank you very much. We are going to have a lecture next week. I have not picked the topic yet. You can make your requests for what you want it to be in the comments of this lecture, but we'll be announcing it in the next couple days. So we're not having any more breaks right now, so instead we'll have a lecture next Tuesday, and we'll see you then.